Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August session of My Story with Ed Bellis, the co-founder of Kenna Security. I am Neha Mishra. I am the Acting Executive Director of TIE Silicon Valley. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, TIE is a not-for-profit organization, and we have the mission of fostering entrepreneurship. Those of you who are familiar with us and are always looking out for the events that we are hosting, we have a couple of great events listed on our website. But I do want to talk about two of our upcoming events that are new in the series. We have the Legal Clinic for Startups coming up, and it's a series where we will be working with legal experts from Chuk Firm, Stevens Law Firm, and Perkins Coie. And we will be bringing up topics like U.S. International Entrepreneur Parole Program, corporate law, patent and trademark. So those of you who are interested in joining, please do look at our website, sv.tie.org, and you will be able to see those. And outside of that, we have a new program that I think we this year started as Mini MBA for Entrepreneurs. And our first session was very, very successful. So we are bringing the second cohort of that. And that is starting on September 23rd. And it's a 3-month program where we will be bringing 6 instructor-led sessions for you. And those of you who are interested can also send us email, programs@tie.org if you're interested. And then we can definitely give more information on that. But today is your My Story event, and I would like to go ahead and introduce the chair for My Story series, Naveen Bisht. As you know, Naveen is the founder and CEO of Akitra, an AI-based cybersecurity and compliance automation company. He was the founder or co-founder and CEO of Starks, Secure Act, Nana Networks, and Ukiah Software, acquired by Novell. He holds 5 patents in the areas of artificial intelligence, security, and networking, and has published several papers and articles on entrepreneurship and industry trends. So without further ado, Naveen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neha. I appreciate your kind intro. So number one, just some housekeeping items for everyone. Before we get started, good evening to all the folks over here, as well as good morning to some of the folks who attend from other parts of the world where it's morning. So one of the things is please get your questions ready in the Q&A part of the screen, and just type it up over there. And in the Q&A session, after the presentation, we'll try to cover all of them. So with that, we'll get going. And so one of the questions I always think about it, and all the entrepreneurs I'm sure think about, is how do you create an entirely new market? And there are a number of them who succeed, and and others succeed in some other way. So how do you really create an entirely new market and a new vulnerability management paradigm business and turn it into a leading modern risk-based vulnerability management company over a decade, and then also get the intent to be acquired by Cisco recently? This is what Ed Bellis did by partnering with Jeff Fair, a software guru, to found Kenna Security back in 2010 to deliver a data-driven, risk-based approach to remediation and help IT teams prioritize and thwart would-be security threats. Kenna's risk-based vulnerability management technology enables organizations to work cross-functionally to rapidly identify, prioritize, and remediate cyber risk. It uses machine learning and data science to track and predict real-world exploitations, empowering security teams to manage the ever-evolving threat landscape. As you all read, almost some organization or something getting hacked every day in the papers and the industry rags. So over the years since its founding, company has garnered a number of industry awards and recognitions. Prior to this, Ed was Chief Information Security Officer at Orbit and Vice President Corporate Information Security at Bank of America. He's also an advisor to a number of companies, including Dharma, and former advisor to Security, Scoreboard.com, and Society of Payment Security Professionals. He's a contributing author to the book, Beautiful Security, and a frequent speaker at industry conferences and events. With that, without taking too much of thrill out of Ed's story, I would like to hand it over to Ed to share his exciting, colorful, and amazing entrepreneurial and professional journey. So let's give a big round of virtual applause to Ed. With that, Ed, to you.
Thank you very much, Naveen, and apologize for making you have to say vulnerability management multiple times. It's been a mouthful that I try typing it out for the last 10 years is not fun either. So yes, as Naveen mentioned, I am the co-founder of Kenna Security and CTO, and we're here to talk about basically the last 10 years of my life. In fact, a little bit more than that. I'm going to go ahead and share out my slides here. One moment, and we'll get started. And Naveen, one time, if you could just give me the confirmation that you're seeing the right slide there.
Yes, looks good.
All right. Okay. So with that being said, let's dive in and talk about really the last 20 years, but mostly the last 10. So how did I get here? It was a long, meandering journey, mostly by accident. So for those of you who are in the cybersecurity space, you'll know, and I suspect that this is not unique to just security, but a lot of different disciplines where you don't necessarily set out to be in cybersecurity. In fact, I'm going to date myself a bit, but my first job out of school in the early 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of cybersecurity to be found, let alone even think about. So this was back in the early 90s. I started off like a lot of folks in the Unix administration side of the house. So I was doing systems administration on not Linux because it didn't yet exist, but we were working on a lot of the mid frames. I worked for a company called CSC, Computer Science Corporation, for a number of folks who probably know them, large government contractor. And I was basically crawling around in, unlike today, as you can see, I am probably a little bit too casual here. But back then I was wearing a full suit and crawling around on a data center floor, building cabling and wiring up networks. So anyway, started off at CSC for a while, where I meandered a bit, and then started to, in my late part of my journey at CSC, I started to get into the development side of the house. And back then, again, I'll just keep dating myself over and over again and just give away my birthday, but we were working on something called PIC Basic. So for all you basic programmers in the house, this was something that was run on the PIC operating system way back then. And we were building out healthcare applications for a lot of insurance providers, hospitals, things like that. HIPAA was certainly not a thing. High tech was certainly not a thing. And frankly, thank goodness, given what I know about the code that went out back then. So did that for a while. My job was really untangling the code and discovering and fixing the bugs that were reported by our customers back then. And that's when I got the opportunity to jump ship. And so I should start out by saying I grew up and was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and spent the first 30 years or so of my life there. This was all back in Detroit. And so what makes sense is the next job I had was at Ford Motor Company. And I had the chance to work in their very early and beginning stages of something they called the World Wide Web group. And our job was to basically build out all of the infrastructure for their extranet. So think of all of the applications that were going online, and this is the very early days of Internet 1.0 at this point. And we were responsible for connecting them with all of their suppliers. They're doing all of their transacting a lot of business. Ultimately, we built out all of the authentication and authorization systems, built our own version of single sign-on way back then, which was crazy thinking about this, 25 years later. And we ended up actually spinning that business unit out, where I got my first kind of real taste of some early, what I'd call intrapreneurship. But we spun out this business that was effectively all of the automotive suppliers and the big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And it was our job to basically manage all of the infrastructure that kept all of those transactions going. So that was pretty exciting times back then, certainly in the early Halcyon days. From there, I actually went off to a Ford supplier, where I was started to build out some of the early web applications for Ford Motor Company at the time, and got the opportunity where I was running a small shop within Detroit to run all of the interactive services for this company for Latin America, which required me to then go down and move to Miami and run the business down there. And Frank, right before that, that is when I met Jeff Hewer. So I hired Jeff Hewer, who is our co-founder at Kenna Security, back in the late 90s. I think this was about 1998 at this point. Hired Jeff out of school. Actually, originally he was at the University of Michigan, did some summer programs with us as a developer. He went back to Michigan, finished up his degree, and then I brought him back on and brought him down to Miami along with several other people to build out all of the interactive services there. So we were doing that for a while. At that point, I got another opportunity to join a joint venture between Ernst & Young and Sprint. And this was in Chicago. So I picked up and moved from Miami to Chicago. And this was actually my first opportunity to run full-time cybersecurity for that particular org. So we were building out, this was building out mobile apps before there were smartphones. So we were building out mobile apps in J2Me on like flip phones and things like that. And it was me and my team were responsible for all the security, not only of the mobile applications, but probably more important back then was all of the Linux machines and servers and everything else that we were building off of there. So I had a good opportunity to really get a good taste of security full time at that point. And this was right around 2000 and the bubble burst. And after the bubble burst, the Capgemini came in and they decided to acquire us and turn us all into consultants, which was not really something that I wanted to do. So I stuck around for a little bit, but then bailed on that. And went off doing a little bit of independent consulting, and then finally ending up at where Naveen said, which was at Bank of America, where I was again in their corporate and information security group, specifically in their global investment and corporate banking arm. So again, a lot of my security experience at Bank of America was all around identity and access management, single sign-on, LDAP, building out authentication services, building out authorization services for all of their applications as it relates to their investment banking arm. So that was early 2001, 2002, that neighborhood in there. And finally, I got recruited in to go and run security as at first security employee number 1 at Orbitz, the online travel company, which kind of brings me to where all of this kind of stuff ultimately got started. So I was first running security as their only employee, and then Orbitz grew like quite a rocket ship. When I got there, we were just, I think we were still private. We IPO'd at that point. This was at the end, I think, of 2003, beginning of 2004, where we IPO'd for the first time. And by the way, interesting story, I actually IPO'd twice while I was at Orbitz. So we went out, IPO'd, we grew quite a bit. We started with, I think when I joined, I want to say we're about 150 people or so. And by the time it fluctuated all the way up to, at some point, we were about 2,000 people. And I'll explain a little bit about that. So we went and IPO'd, were there for about another 10 months as a public company when a large conglomerate known as Sendent Corporation came in and acquired us whole. And they did something really interesting, which is we got acquired, and they had a bunch of other travel business units. So they owned cheaptickets.com, if those are familiar with that. They also owned Hotel Club, which was in Australia. They bought eBookers out of London. And they had Galileo was probably their largest travel property. And what that was is their global distribution system. So if you bought, as an example, a ticket on United Airlines, that was all routed through and run through Galileo. In fact, one of the interesting things about them that was kind of scary as we were going through it is if Galileo goes down, they ground planes, which was not something that we were certainly used to in orbits in the online travel space. So as part of that, when we were acquired, they actually took all of those travel businesses and put them underneath Orbitz. And then I was, instead of just being head of security at Orbitz, I was the chief information security officer for all of their travel distribution systems. So all of those properties that I told you about globally around the world. And that really started to introduce some of the problems that we set out to solve at Kenna Security. So at Kenna, one of the things that I noticed quite a bit was we started to do a lot of vulnerability assessments, and being an online property and being a company that is almost completely just made up of software, you can imagine there's a lot of different ways and things that you need to assess. Certainly there's the infrastructure and what we would call the traditional vulnerability assessment, right? You have a vulnerability scanner that goes out and scans all of your servers, all of your desktops, laptops, network devices, and things like that, looking for security vulnerabilities. And we got plenty of those in. And then, of course, we think of that and then times it by the number of properties that I just told you about, where those were all effectively came in through acquisitions. So they all had their own different unique environments. They had their own different unique tools, all doing this same thing. Add on top of that, they had what we call static analysis, or scanning that's looking at source code for vulnerabilities. They also had scanning that was looking at their web applications for vulnerabilities. We had penetration testers, consulting firms that came in that tried to do assessments on all of our different applications as well. On top of that, because we were a big online shop, we had a lot of requirements around PCI, or the payment card industry. So by way of accepting all of this credit card information, we had certain requirements and certain assessments and scans that we had to go through as part of that as well. And times that by every single property that I just talked about, and all of their unique applications and their unique infrastructure. And guess what? What we found was there's vulnerabilities everywhere. that was lesson number one, is we had way more vulnerabilities than we had people to actually fix these vulnerabilities. On top of that, we had a problem of duplication, right? Because we had so many different tools. We had tools that were looking at it from the inside. We had tools that were coming in and looking at it from the outside. We had people that were looking at it from both directions. So they were sometimes finding the same things. So we had a team of people that were dedicated to kind of pouring through this and weeding out all of these duplicates. On top of that, we had false positives. So a lot of these tools would actually report vulnerabilities that actually weren't vulnerabilities, right? For whatever reason, they either thought that vulnerability existed, or maybe we had some other control on the network side of things that would prevent any sort of attack of that vulnerability. Well, the same team of people that are pouring through all this data now got to pour through and look and say, okay, is this a false positive? Is this a real vulnerability? So they get through all of this and they say, okay, we know it's real. We've deduped it. It's not a duplicate anymore. How important is this, right? So if I've got 500,000 vulnerabilities, I can't fix all 500,000. So how important is this one that I get this assigned out to a resource? So a lot of manual assessment goes on. The team goes on and they keep kind of pouring through all this to try to understand, okay, We've now whittled this down. It's a smaller list. It's not duplicative. There are no false positives. We believe these are the important things. Let's go get these people, generate some tickets, work with the operations teams, work with the developers, and see if we can't go ahead and get this fixed. So we go out, get it all fixed, come back, reassess, and the pile grew by 20%. Not because we didn't fix things, but new things were introduced all across there, right? So keep in mind, not all of this software is our software, right? We buy off the shelf software. Perfect example is you're running Microsoft Windows. Every first Tuesday of every month, they come out with a new list of vulnerabilities for you to go fix. Times that by tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of assets, servers and desktops and laptops that you might have, that becomes a lot of vulnerabilities. Well, you got to do this over and over and over again. And the pile just kept growing and growing and growing. And it was just, it just felt like a battle that we were never going to win. So that's when I actually started reaching out to some of my peers and saying, hey, what are you guys doing to solve this? This doesn't seem like this should be that hard of a problem. It feels like basic hygiene to me. And turned out everybody that I talked to were doing pretty much the same things we were doing over at Orbitz, which is to say either they had a massive spreadsheet if they were lucky, or they probably had some homegrown system and a team of people that were pouring through this stuff. And they were that the one thing I did find out though is that we were actually in the very luxurious position at Orbitz, and that we didn't have a whole lot of legacy systems. We didn't have a whole lot of sprawl because we weren't that old. But we were I started talking to some of these other folks that were CISOs at other large enterprises. And where we were dealing with hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, they were doing tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of vulnerabilities. So it was only worse for others. So that's when I gave Jeff, who I'd met, as I mentioned, way back when working at the Ford supplier in the late 90s. We'd kept in touch throughout. By this time, Jeff had went off and moved to New York City to get his MBA from Columbia. So he was wrapping up his MBA at Columbia and just looking for what was going to be his next thing. And I called him up and I said, I think I have our next thing. And it is going out and building something to solve this problem. So that's what we set out to do. So this was towards the end of 2010 at this point. And so we went out and founded a company at the time called Honey Apps. Yeah, no one's ever heard of Honey Apps because by the time we actually had a product, we were no longer Honey Apps. But we raised a seed round of funding at the time led by Tugboat Ventures, which was a small VC in Palo Alto, as well as Hyde Park Angels, which is an angel group here in Chicago, which is where I am based. And we went out and raised just over $1 million to basically kind of build out the proof of concept of what we thought we had here. So we started hiring a couple of engineers and building out really what I would call the table stakes of all this, right? So before I can take all this, make sense of all of this data for an organization, I need to be able to intake all of this data. And that in itself was quite an undertaking. And I will tell you to this day is still an undertaking, right? So we've got, I don't know, now I would say about 75, 80 different integrations into all of these different tools to take in all of this data. We had to normalize all the data, obviously dedupe it, and do a lot of making sense of that data. But before we did all that, we had to build a lot of plumbing. So we were starting to do that. We started to get some early beta customers. I want to say our very first beta customer that was paying us was a company called Sears. So for those who still remember the old department store, they had an online shop, Sears.com, and they were using us. In fact, one of the funny stories there was, so Kenna Security is and has been for many, many years a software as a service. But when we started and we deployed to Sears, it was effectively our service in a box. And that box was a box that I acquired, I want to say on Craigslist. And I went out and found somebody who had a server. I had to go find a keyboard and monitor and everything just to get this software set up on there, because we had everything in the cloud, but then we had to go out and build the application, load it up onto this box that they were going to rack mount over at Sears. So that ended up being a fun process of tracking down a machine to use, wiping it, meeting this guy in a basement to effectively get our first deployment off the ground, and then hand delivering, driving that box downtown Chicago, where they're going to rack mount this machine. So that was a fun early memory for us. And then by this time we went out and raised a Series A, and changed our name to Risk.io, which some people actually might know, as we actually were starting to sell product under that name. And so we raised a Series A from US Venture Partners. Again, that's in Menlo Park there. Jacques Benkowski joined our board as a partner from there. I should mention Dafina Tancheva, who was our board member from Tugboat, and then she actually moved over to USVP as part of this as well. So we raised that A round, and actually started to use this to not only build some things out, but start to test, are there ways that we could sell this, right? And you mentioned building a market or creating a market. I wouldn't recommend it for most people. It's a lot of work. It's a slog. It's a lot of evangelistic sales, and it's a heck of a lot of trial, error, and learning. And one of the things that we learned early on was we built out this application and people started to use it. And it was like, okay, this is, it's nice, right? It's a nice to have. It's not something that I'm going to spend a whole lot of money on, because what you've done is you've aggregated all of my problems into a single pane of glass view, right? So I don't have to log into 8 different systems to do this. I can log into one and see, yes, I have a lot of vulnerabilities. You've provided a little bit of analytics and reporting on top of it, but it's still nice to have. So it was really, I attribute our product market fit to really 2 things. I would say there's a product market fit, and then there was a market fit, right? So the product market fit for us was a little bit of happenstance. We were trying to figure out how are we going to go about prioritizing these vulnerabilities for our customers. And what we ended up finding out or running into was Roger Thornton, who was then CTO of a company called Alien Vault. And I met Roger actually going back to our seed round when we were pitching Tugboat Ventures. And we were in the final pitch. They brought in Roger as an advisor to Tugboat to hear the pitch, go through it, and understand. And at that time, he was not at Alien Vault, but he was with a company called Fortify, which HP ended up buying. In what Fortify did was they were a static analysis, so they discovered vulnerabilities in software. So he knew the space quite well. Anyway, the funny thing about that meeting, obviously, we ended up raising the seed round there. But at some point, he was so enthusiastic about what we were about to embark on and do that the Tugboat folks, Dave Wharton and Dafina, said, Roger, would you like to go sit on the other side of the table? Because clearly you're a plant for these guys. But anyway, that worked out well for us early on. And then I later met up with Roger at the RSA Security Conference, and he sat down with me. He goes, "Hey, we're actually in the process of, we've got tens of thousands of customers around the world that have all deployed our what they call a SIEM, a security information and event management system that monitors networks looking for security incidents." And he said, "We've got all this telemetry and we're looking for ways to expose it. And we want to kind of open source this and we call it the Open Threat Exchange. Any of this data valuable to you?" And I said, heck yeah. So especially the ones that, as it relates to exploiting vulnerabilities. Turned out later, we were working together, and then he ended up joining our board as part of representing Tugboat later on. And he goes, you know, that data that you have there, that's not attacks that you have from Open Threat Exchange that we've built for you. Those are successful attacks, right? So you actually have something that probably nobody else has. Anyway, our product market fit came right down to that moment, because what we were able to do was then incorporate that data directly into our platform. So we started to take in all this data from our customers about their vulnerabilities and their assets, their technology assets, and we combined it with what attackers were doing across the internet. And we were able to successfully start to prioritize and say, hey, this one is most important. This is the one that is likely going to end up being attacked for you. And we suddenly gave our customers a view of things that they didn't have a view of before. What's going on outside of their four walls, and how does it relate to the things going on inside their four walls? And that was where we really started to see an uptick, and people started to say, hey, I get it, I pay for this. And they actually did start to pay for it, thank God. Now from there, I talked a little bit about product market fit. There was also this big market fit opportunity for us. And as a little bitty startup called Risk.io back then, we ended up signing a deal with Dell SecureWorks, who was probably, if not the largest, certainly the top 2 largest managed service security firms in the world. And we were able to do this because we ended up hiring a very scrappy individual by the name of David French. And what he did, he came to us from Qualys, which was a big vulnerability assessment tool. And they had just signed a deal with SecureWorks, and he was directly involved in that. So when he came on with us, he said, hey, we would make a perfect complement to that. If they're out there selling Qualys, we can overlay on top of that and prioritize all that data for them. So he reached out to the same contacts that he was working with, and he was able to close a deal with a company that we should not have been able to close a deal with back then, quite honestly, but we were able to do that. And I remember we were flying down to Atlanta for their sales kickoff, the SecureWorks sales kickoff. And they would come in, and we were the only third-party vendor there. And it was our job to train all of the sales teams on what was then Risk.io. And each sales team would come in, and they'd have a Fortune 500 sales team. They would have a Global 2000. They would have an Asia team. They would have an SMB team, all of these different sales teams. And every sales team that came in for a training session, all those sales teams each one of them were larger than our entire company. So suddenly, not only were we seeing product market fit, but now we had a sales force to actually sell it that was well beyond our means. So that worked out pretty well for us. It certainly took off better than we had hoped in the early days. In fact, they sold more of Risk.io back then in the very first week than we had sold in the history of our company. So that was doing well. We started to we raised another, or I shouldn't say, we raised an extra tranche onto our Series A, and we decided it's time to bring in a CEO. So I've never been a CEO. I was obviously in the early days here, but my passion is around the product, the technology. Obviously what we did in those early days to get that product market fit is something that I was pretty excited about. And I really wanted to build a successful company out of this. So yeah, a little bit of an inside joke here. This is Kareem Tuba, who is our current, CEO up until we were acquired by Cisco, at least. And he's holding a Starbucks cup here. And I made him do that because it's probably the one and only time one will ever see a Starbucks cup in his hand, despite the fact that Starbucks is, and has been for a number of years, one of our big customers. He's a bit of a coffee snob. So if you ever meet him, please make sure to make fun of him for that. In fact, when we interviewed him, we flew him out to Chicago to meet the engineering team here in Chicago. And Jeff, our co-founder, took him out to Starbucks, of course, not knowing that he's a total coffee snob. But anyway, we brought in Kareem. Kareem came to us from Juniper Networks, where he ran the security business over there. But he's been a longtime product management guy. And specifically, I actually previously had met him when I was the CISO at Orbitz, I ended up buying an encryption appliance from his company, and he came out, or I met with him as part of that. And he was heading up all of product management back then for that company, and that ended up working out. And I will say, we got lucky, because obviously if you hire the wrong CEO, things can go terrible in a hurry, and it's really hard to correct. So Kareem and I had a series of discussions about the market, about the business, where we are, where we wanted to go, things like that. And it became very apparent to us at this point, we needed to go up market. So we did that. We were mostly by probably our own capabilities within the mid-market space, I say, for the most part, with a little bit of SMB. But we decided, you know what, the bigger the company is, the bigger of a problem this is for them that they're going to solve. Remember when I told you at the very beginning, when I said, I was talking to orgs that had hundreds of millions of vulnerabilities? That is very real, and that's a very real problem. So that's what we did. And things really started to take off for us, right? So we started to see a lot of success in the upper market. Obviously, we needed to retool both on the sales, the marketing, and even to a degree on the product itself in order to handle all of this data. But that's what we were focused on. And then we hit 2020. So everybody knows the great pandemic. It didn't kill our business by any means. I would say what it did was slow us down, and it's in some ways dramatically, right? So we were doing a really great clip of a growth business all the way through, up until 2019 or so, and then we were in 2020. And one of the problems with going up market is you get longer sales cycles in those enterprise businesses. You also end up in a position, at least for us, where it tends to be quarterly business that's back-end loaded, right? So for Q1, we would actually do more business in March than January, February put together, right? In fact, I would say we probably did 2/3 of our business, maybe even 70% of our business in the third month of any quarter. Well, if you remember when COVID really started to shut things down in the US, that was in March of 2020. In other words, when everything was in procurement for us, right? And then suddenly all these big enterprise companies went home and they shut down, and the procurement teams they didn't even have a VPN connection. They had no idea how to even connect into their systems. So what ended up happening is deals that were supposed to close in March closed in late April. Deals that were supposed to close in April closed in June, right? So in some ways, we had a great Q2 because everything that was supposed to be closed in Q1 ended up closing in Q2 for the most part, but a devastating Q1, and everything just kind of kept pushing and pushing and pushing. So it was a slow slog, but we really started to see things pick up again in Q4. And that's when I first got the call from our friends at Cisco. So I happen to know the co-founders of Duo Security, which was acquired by Cisco a few years back. And Doug Song, who was the CEO of Duo, gave me a call in December of 2020 and said, hey, we've decided, we being Cisco, that risk-based vulnerability management is going to be strategic to our business going forward. And we want to have a discussion with you. It's going to be about M&A. I'll be very upfront about that. But we're going to set the stage, set the process. Let me know if you're open to it. And, we had actually talked to these guys during our raise of our Series D, and when was that? I think 2019, as a part of their venture arm and participating in our Series D. We couldn't make them work fast enough, so we ended up going and we raised money from Sorensen Capital back then, but we stayed in touch. So to these guys' credit, they've done 240 plus acquisitions. They laid out the process. They said, here's the timeline, here's the milestones, here's what's going to happen. And almost to a day, they hit those milestones and laid out that process perfectly. We did a ton of due diligence, right? They did due diligence in January and February before actually giving us an LOI. I think that was at the beginning of March. They gave us the LOI. And basically after the LOI, they did what they called confirmatory diligence, which was another 2 months of diligence confirming what they thought they learned during due diligence. So tons of work going on. Bless the folks in finance and HR and all the work that they had to do, plus some additional stuff that went on across the business to ultimately get to a point where Naveen mentioned the announcement of the intent, which was the closing and the definitive docs and things like that were signed. That was at the beginning of May. And then we did finally close the deal. So we are part of Cisco as of June 29th. So it's been about a month and a half that I have now been a Cisco employee. So that is kind of a very super condensed version of my last 10 years or so. But with that, I am happy to open up and take any questions from the group. Naveen.
Yep. Thank you. Just trying to see how I think you have to stop sharing, I guess.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Really amazing story. Really appreciate it very much. And so let me start off with the first question. I think you meant, really very exciting to hear a lot of things I didn't know, of course, earlier. That's the idea of the story. And so first one, I was just thinking, in going to the more on the industry side, there are almost I remember a few years ago, there are about, on a few thousand startups right now in the whole cybersecurity space, right? Over 3,000 or something, someone had mentioned to me. And so how did you manage to rise above that noise level?
Yeah.
Of course you had, you've been at it for a while, the number of customers, but in general, there is always hype, this whole AI, ML, everything, so if you can please elaborate on that, that'll be awesome.
Yeah, it's one of those typical 10-year overnight success stories. So what we did is, and I wouldn't say we rose above the noise per se. I think it helps to start with a problem and not start with a technology, right? You hear so much overhype now with machine learning and artificial intelligence and things like that. I would call what we do applied machine learning or applied AI, and the fact that we had a problem that we knew that there's at least a piece of this problem could be solved with machine learning, and that's what we used it for. We found the right tool for the job. We didn't start out with a tool and say, all right, what can I fix with this tool? So that was important for us, and early on, it is tough to rise above that noise, and you're not going to. So if you have a real problem that people are feeling real pain about, the good news is they will go out and seek out a solution. And that's what we probably benefited for more than anything.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. So let me go to the question from the audience. From Sanjay, friend of mine from Kenna Security, actually used to be my co-founder at Vikaya Software. So he says, congrats, Ed, on an outstanding outcome and innovating in a space often perceived to be mature and somewhat of a whack-a-mole. So I don't know what that means. I'm sure
I know what that means.
Know. Okay, all right. I'd like to hear your perspective as to why the industry has not moved to a proactive approach, such as allow, list, whitelist, or positive model.
I think in some ways they have become more proactive. Now, I'm biased in that who I'm looking at are Kenna customers, right? Yeah. So I'm not able to see outside of that purview. But one of the things that we kind of introduced as part of this that I thought was great, right? So first you have to start reactive, right? When you got 100 million vulnerabilities, you just got to start reactive. You got to start prioritizing that stuff down. And really there's two ways to solve that problem. One is through relentless prioritization, which is what we focused on at Kenna. And the two is automation. And ideally you're combining both of those together to get a better result. But what we did was we started to see customers that were starting to actually catch up and be ahead of the game in some cases, right? So, and certainly for they would divide up their environments, and for their environments that were really important to them or where they had really sensitive information, they would really start to get pretty good about that. but they still were stuck in this reactive mode of, oh, new vulnerabilities came out from Microsoft. Now I got to go patch these. New vulnerabilities came out from Oracle. Now I got to go patch these. And it was very reactive. So what we said was, well, first off, let's prioritize and focus on the things that are most likely to be attacked. And then the next step we said is, let's start predicting what things are going to be attacked in the future, so you can fix those now before the attackers start to attack those. And that's really kind of what I would say is about the kind of cutting edge, if you will, of vulnerability management in terms of being proactive versus a reactive state, because there's just so much stuff out there.
Right. And it's ever changing, especially now everything is, it's like, are these virtual conferences, right? Everything which you didn't think would happen.
It is. And it's like, everybody keeps deploying new software, but the old stuff never goes away either. So it just becomes more software. Right.
So obviously that's a boon for all of us who are in the cybersecurity market.
For sure.
Yep. Next question is from an anonymous attendee. When you were shifting the company through its various stages, any particular anecdotes around learnings, number 2 things to avoid?
So I'll go back to the very early days when we were searching for product market fit. Be relentless in terms of pushing something out, testing it, and then going back and being just as quick as you can about that, and I say this virtually, I guess now, but get out of the office, right? Get in front of customers, get feedback, know that one of the things that I thought is kind of a funny anecdote is you start to learn the differences between the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest when dealing with these customers, right? The Midwest, which is where I am, it's actually a little bit painful from a sales perspective because nobody wants to hurt your feelings, right? And really, the thing that can kill a startup is the long, slow maybe. You want a fast yes or a fast no, and here's why. So that was an entertaining anecdote, but sometimes pretty painful, especially when our early focus, since we were in Chicago, was a lot of these companies in the Midwest that slowed us down a bit.
So what is the difference in the West Coast versus East Coast? I'm just curious.
East Coast is great in the sense that they have no problems telling you like it is, and if your product is crap, they're going to tell you your product is crap, which is what you want to hear. Right now, you want to hear why it is.
Right.
One thing about the West Coast, I find with a lot of the companies out there, is they oftentimes, especially the tech companies, right? They have even the financial services companies to a degree have a build over buy mentality, right? It's like, I can build that, right? So you gotta, that's the inertia you often have to fight there, is why your product is better than something that they could build and have to maintain over time.
Yeah, oh, that's awesome. I learned something very new here, which I never thought about, So next question is from Prakash Narayan, and he says, we had a keynote from Nikesh Arora at the recently TiCon in May. TiCon is one of the large entrepreneurial conference in May, at just FYI.
Mm-hmm.
So from what he said, it would seem that Kenna Security would be a company on their radar. And Nikesh is the CEO of Palo Alto Networks, as you probably know.
Mm-hmm.
So his question is, did you compete with them, with Palo Alto, I'm guessing?
We did not compete with Palo Alto. So obviously we're a part of Cisco now, which, and Cisco's a giant business, Palo Alto's a giant business. There's several areas where they do compete. There's several areas where they don't compete. There are several products that we integrate and work with directly with Palo Alto as an example, right? So all of their, I believe you did one of these actually with, I want to say the Demisto founder. So Demisto does an integration with Kenna Security as an example, right? We work with them on that. We work with them on a few other products they have, like Prisma, which does assessments of their cloud container things looking for vulnerabilities. So they have a lot of data that ultimately makes its way into Kenna. So Kenna itself is not competitive with Palo Alto, but certainly there's a lot of competition that goes on between Cisco and Palo Alto.
Thank you. Let me ask another question before we get any from the audience. So this is more like individual as an entrepreneur, I would say. What are some of the things that you're proud of while you are building Kenna Security, and who influenced you most over there, you think, if you want to know?
That the latter part's a hard one. There's so many people. I'm proud of a ton of things. When I think back, I mean, people often ask, how did you ever imagine that this outcome or this exit? And the answer is I never stuck my head up long enough to think about it, right? You had to survive to the next, either funding round or something like that. You've got an X amount of runway that you're working with. You got to be just maniacally focused on ensuring that the burn rate is right and that you're generating enough business and you get to that next milestone so that you can keep going. So in that sense, it's hard for me to come back and say, it was this one moment or things like that. I can certainly remember, like I said in the presentation, that the product market fit thing really stuck out for me. I'm really proud actually that we created a market that didn't exist when we started. I remember meeting with some of the folks in the vulnerability assessment industry who told me that this isn't a market at the beginning, that they said, look, people should just fix all their stuff. And I knew coming in from the practitioner's angle that that's not a possibility, and it's only going to get worse over time. Now, it was a lot of work and a slog to get there, and we hired a lot of good people to help us get there. But yeah, there was probably the biggest thing that I think about is just now I look and I feel like there's 100 RBVM vendors out there, right? I walk the RSA show floor and it's like, oh yeah, we compete with Kenna. I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Nobody competed with us 7 or 8 years ago. Maybe a consulting agency or two, but that was about it.
Oh, that's nice. So you don't think the company which Microsoft acquired recently, I thought that probably was a little bit in
Risk IQ?
Yeah.
No, so they were not competing with us, but I didn't even bring this up as part of the presentation. A funny little story is, you remember we used to be called Risk IO.
Right.
We are not called Risk IO anymore because of some conflicts in naming, shall we say.
Okay. All right. So the next question is from Vinay Anand, one of our friends and a long-term security executive. So his question is, the cyber security landscape is very dynamic and rapidly expanding, especially with increasing adoption of cloud. So where do you see emerging opportunities? If you were to do something new now, where would you focus as an entrepreneur, I guess?
That's a great question. And you're always kind of focused on the problem at hand, but you keep seeing these other problems come up and going, oh, I got to make a note to remember that, because when I get out of this business, that's the next business I'm going to get into. But it's been 10 years. So to me, there's a theme, right? I don't know that I wouldn't say there's any one area. I really want to get into something with containers or something in the cloud or whatever, which certainly applies. I would say, to me, the broader themes that stand out is there's still, and obviously this is right in the wheelhouse of Kenna, but other things as well in security, which is to say there are more things to do than there are people to do them. So if you can fix that problem in any area, in the SOC, in vulnerability management, in network security, in the cloud, wherever it might be, and say, you know what, we've got a way to either prioritize this stuff so you don't have to worry about all these things, or we have a way to automate these things so you don't have to have people manually doing all this stuff, or ideally both. That's where I would be applying my efforts to, because we're not going to, Excel spreadsheet our way out of these problems.
Right, absolutely. So the next question is from Rasali. We have many first-time entrepreneurs in the Thai ecosystem. So what would be your advice to them on facing early rejections? Obviously, that's a very loaded word. Rejection from your investors, rejection from your customers, partners. So would love to have you elaborate on that. What would be your advice to them?
So I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The question is, like, in the whole Thai ecosystem, and even attendees, a lot of them are entrepreneurs, some of them are first-time entrepreneurs. And so what would be your advice to them on facing early rejection? And I was just kind of expanding on rejection because that's a loaded word. I said rejection from your investors, rejection from your customers. Sometimes you think you're getting a deal, then last minute deal's gone out the window. And rejection from sometimes your, aligned partners, right? Large companies again, as a startup. I call it, I have a joke, sorry, just to add. I have a joke I have a joke with my friends, like in my startup days, my co-founder would say, oh, there is another hard startup. They've raised more money than you have. Let's go talk to them for partnership because they have this piece missing. And I'll tell him, there's no point one beggar going to another beggar. I said, we need to find kings.
Yeah, that's right.
So obviously we are choosing the larger ones. So anyway,
that's right. Yeah. And what I can relate as both a first-time founder and seeing tons of rejection. I talked quickly through the presentation, given our limited amount of time, but if I had spent any amount of time on our early funding rounds, when we raised our seed back in end of 2010, beginning of 2011, I probably got rejected by 50 plus VCs. Yeah. It was brutal. And we lucked out finding Defina and Tugboat to get that going. But in the Series A was slightly easier, but not much. I'll tell you where it got different for us was Series C onward. I would say we were, we're into the growth stage, and the raise was more of a spreadsheet exercise about, all of the CAC or SaaS metrics of the business. Right. But prior to that, there's a lot of selling the story. And as a first-time founder, you're going to get tons of rejection, and the same can be said on the sales side as to, why should I trust you? Now, I did have some advantages probably on the sales side, not on the VC side. It was brutal, but on the sales side, I at least had my practitioner hat, right? I could tell. I mean, in some cases, I was a CISO along with them for 7, 8, 10 years, so they at least. There's a little bit of trust there, but that didn't make it. They weren't going to spend their money any easier. They might open the door and listen to me at least before rejecting me. But I don't know if I have any advice other than to have incredibly thick skin and ask pointed questions to get a lot of the whys out of them, right? Because VCs will tell you no, or they'll tell you not right now. But they don't want to hurt your feelings either. In some ways, it is like dealing with Midwesterners because they want to keep that door open in case you're successful later on. Hey, I might want to invest in your Series B or something like that. So you got to be able to pull that out of them. Practitioners a little less so, but you got to have thick skin and you got to figure out the whys. Right.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Like Ed, you said. Even one of my friends recently is a very successful serial entrepreneur, and he says he did seed, he's going to go to the next round. And he was saying even the guys who said they will do their seed said, okay, I'm going to put the money. They introduced him to 30 VCs, and few of them, they want to meet you, he says, and they waste your time. So he created these 4 questions before going to them. He said, let me know, is there anyone, have you invested in this space? Does anyone know anything? Otherwise, I'm not coming. Because, he's gone through this a number of times, and then he finally got someone. He said, okay, I'm interested. And he said, just eliminated even wasting his time, he said. Not because, like you said, VCs, they don't want to hurt your feelings, but some of them, they have to also hear, secondly, every week, because they need to say, I met 50 companies. I mean, that's just, that's part of their partnership, update, right? Or whatever. So, but may not necessarily, they might have decided, he said, just right from the first, your email that they don't want to invest, but they will still meet you, he says.
I mean, what he's doing is sales qualification, right? The same thing you do in sales. Do you have budget, authority, need, timing? All right, let's move on.
Exactly. Well, next question from the audience from Hemant Puri, a friend of ours. So he says, did Kenna have an engagement with Cisco, either at the business development level or any product integrations, I guess, before Cisco approached Kenna for M&A?
We did not have integrations. We absolutely did have engagements with business development. So as I mentioned, during our Series D raise, we went out and reached out to those guys and pitched them, and had a lot of conversations with them, worked actually with their office of CTO, talked about some potential go-to-market opportunities for us. We never got there. Sorensen kind of beat them to the punch, and we took off. But we did have some initial, a lot of talks with them. In fact, on and off, we still talked to some of the folks over there up until the acquisition.
Yeah. So next question is from Mihir. I think it's Mohanty. So he's asking, when can we see risk-based cybersecurity, or how close are we?
When can we see risk-based cybersecurity, or how close are? Oh, that's so.
I think you can tell that he's a security. He has a lot of security background too.
Yeah, no, and you know what? It's something. So I'm a big fan, obviously, of we're risk-based vulnerability management, but I believe that you should be risk-based everything in cybersecurity, right? And it's not just cybersecurity. I mean, when you think about it, what you're really doing is you're prioritizing, right? And what you're saying is this is more important than this, and you got to do that all the time. I put on my product management hat, and I choose, this feature is more important for us to build than this one because of X, Y, or Z. But I go all the way back to, I was kind of largely influenced back with, I don't know if anybody can tell, I'm a baseball fan, which also means I'm a big stats person as well. And as part of that, I kind of fell in love with the book Moneyball way back when, saw the movie, of course, as well. But this idea that you could do more with less, right? And it's really about, in the case of cybersecurity, you're doing it by looking at what is the actual risk, and the risk goes down to what is the likelihood of something bad happening, and how bad is it if it does happen, right? And then how can I lessen that? And that's a big broad question, is when can we get to risk-based cybersecurity? I'll use this time to endorse an organization that I'm familiar with called SIRA, which is the Society of Information Risk Analysts. They put out tons of great work in cybersecurity as it relates to quantitative risk, which I'm a big fan of. So check those guys out if you haven't.
Oh, nice. Thank you. So it looks like we're running almost close to, we are a couple of minutes past. So the last question I'll ask you, Ed, is could you share some of your experiences while obviously building Kenna, is how it has helped you personally and professionally as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll caveat all this in that, the early days were tough. In fact, I didn't mention this during the presentation, but when I left Orbitz in my, I guess, cushy job to go out and found what became Kenna Security, my wife was pregnant at the time with our fourth child. So needless to say, she was very supportive, but that's not overly enthusiastic, shall we say, in the early days. So one of the things that I really was able to learn is it's so interesting now just to think back at all of the different areas of the business and thinking about everything. Really, I mean, you hear this all the time. In fact, one of the things I really liked about at Orbitz was it was a very entrepreneurial company. In fact, there's some articles that have come out since of there's roughly, I think, 25 different startups that have started out of companies that people who have left Orbitz and went out and started their own thing. So, there was a lot of that encouragement, and you got to start to think of your area of the business. And in my case, it was security. Thinking of that as a business, right? Thinking of that as a P&L and understanding how does that benefit the broader business, and always not thinking about, oh, okay, so this is, I need to get this done, and you got to think about it. Well, what does that hurt, right? By getting this done as a business. So being just more broad-minded and entrepreneurial thinking about how does this all benefit the broader we. It's been a great experience and still is.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Ed. So with that, I think we'd like to conclude today's talk, and we really appreciate you being here. I know it's already 9 o'clock for you back in Midwest. I'm sure they eat supper pretty early, I think, right?
Yeah, I ate before this started. I'm good.
Yeah. All right. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. Thank you all the attendees Our next talk is going to be on next September 14th. We have the gentleman CloudGenix founder coming and sharing his story. Palo Alto, obviously, are competitors. They bought that company. And then we have in the following month is another gentleman from security space. So lots of security acquisitions, as you can tell. So it's a hot space. If you're entrepreneurs, you want to start. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Ed, again. Really appreciate your time and sharing your amazing story.